I'd been a nurse for a few years, working in various hospitals and facilities, but nothing I'd experienced prepared me for the horrors of my last week at a geriatric hospital, just 30 minutes from my home. I thought I knew what to expect from working with elderly patients. Patients who were often vulnerable and sometimes volatile, but generally just people in need of compassion and care. Most nights there was a familiar rhythm, a sense of calm once the patients had fallen asleep, even if their minds remained somewhere else. I had only been at this hospital for a couple of weeks, but it would soon become clear why that was enough to make it my last. On my second to last shift at the hospital, I was scheduled to work the graveyard shift. I was running on barely any sleep. Negative hours, it felt like. I'd been trying to adjust to the brutal nighttime hours, but the constant disruption to my schedule was wearing me down. I felt sluggish, weighed down, but it was nothing a few more shifts couldn't fix, or so I thought. I was assigned to the Alzheimer's ward that night. The patients in this ward were usually the same each evening, and most of them had become familiar with me. Being in my early 20s, I seemed to bring a comforting presence, perhaps a reminder of the now. I often felt like an anchor for them, something that tethered them to reality in a way they couldn't achieve alone. One particular patient named Lena stood out that night. Lena was older, frail, with soft white hair, and an expression that alternated between confusion and fear. This was my first night being assigned to her directly, though I'd seen her around the ward before. As I made my rounds, she began to express something unsettling. Every time I entered her room, she'd look at me with wide eyes and tell me about the voices she heard, voices that were apparently constant and relentless, whispering things only she could hear. She told me she kept seeing a man dressed in black, standing in the corner of her room watching her. Her eyes would dart to the corner as she spoke, and her fingers would shake as she pointed. The other patient in her room, a quiet woman, had even requested that her curtain be drawn, hoping it would give her a bit of distance from Lena's constant muttering. Lena's roommate smiled at me whenever I came by, but otherwise she said little, nodding off more often than not. By 11 p.m., most of the ward had gone quiet. The patients were finally asleep, and I hoped that Lena would find rest as well. But she called for me again, her voice a shaky whisper over the intercom. I walked to her room, trying to calm her, reminding her to breathe, reassuring her that everything was okay. Her eyes locked onto me, filled with a fear that I couldn't quite shake off. She kept murmuring about the man in black, saying he was watching her, that he wouldn't leave her alone. I didn't want to disturb her roommate, so I held Lena's hands, speaking softly, promising her that she wasn't alone, that I was right there if she needed anything. Eventually, she seemed to calm down, her breathing slowing as she fell into what I hoped would be a peaceful sleep. As the night wore on, time began to drag. When you're on a night shift in a place like this, every minute feels stretched out, like time itself has slowed to a crawl. It was around 2 a.m. when I found myself in the linen room, stocking supplies to prepare for the following day. The linen room was a small, dimly lit space, quiet and contained. I closed the door behind me to keep the noise down as I worked. As I was arranging the linens, I heard a faint sound, like a shuffling from within the room. It was strange. There shouldn't have been anyone else in there with me. I paused, turning to look around, but the room was empty. I shook it off, assuming it was my exhaustion playing tricks on me, and continued my work. Then suddenly I felt it, a distinct, heavy weight on my shoulder, as if someone had laid a hand there. My heart jumped, a cold dread settling in. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. The room was empty. I could feel the place where the hand had been, my skin tingling from the pressure. I backed up against the shelves, feeling my chest tighten with fear, but there was no one. My mind raced with explanations, rationalizing it as some sort of muscle twitch, an after effect of sleeplessness. I stepped out into the hallway, needing a moment to collect myself, but the silence of the ward only intensified my anxiety. It was eerily still, each step echoing down the corridor. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone or something, but it was empty. I took a few deep breaths, willing myself to shake off the unsettling feeling, and headed back to my cart, determined to finish stocking the supplies. But just as I turned to face the door, I saw him, A figure dressed in black, standing just outside the window, staring at me with a smile that sent a chill down my spine. He was tall, his figure slightly blurred in the dim light, but his smile was unmistakable, a grin that was both sinister and unwavering. I froze, unable to move, my mind racing through all the possible explanations, all the ways this could be anything but real. But the figure didn't waver, didn't vanish. He just kept staring, his eyes never leaving mine. I screamed, the sound echoing through the ward, loud enough to wake the patients. Within moments, one of the other nurses came rushing in, her face a mask of concern. I pointed toward the window, barely able to speak, but the figure had vanished. She looked around, confused, asking what had happened, but I could barely form the words. The man in black, I managed to stammer, my voice shaking. She looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief, and together we checked the ward, making sure everything was secure. But there was no sign of anyone dressed in black. As we went to check on Lena, she was wide awake, her eyes filled with terror as she clutched her blanket. She looked at me, her voice trembling as she asked, "Did you see him too? The man in black? He was here, wasn't he?" My heart skipped a beat. She described the same figure I had seen, down to the eerie smile, the dark clothes, the unblinking stare. She began to cry, pleading for us to take her away, screaming that he was coming for her. Her fear was raw, tangible, a reflection of the terror I felt. That night, I was moved to a different ward. I left early, shaken, unable to shake the image of the man's grin from my mind. The next day, I told the head nurse that I couldn't continue, that my next shift would be my last. The experience left me haunted, unsure of what was real, unsure of my own mind. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural, but that night felt like something beyond explanation, a brush with something I hoped to never encounter again.